What's up, everyone, and welcome to Save the Game Media's review discussion and spoilercast for Senua's Saga Hellblade 2. I will be your host for today's proceedings, Kevin, aka the Muffin Mon, and I'm joined not by Project X Talk Sam, not by an Xbox fanboy. I got Sam from No Limits. How you doing, Sam?
I'm doing very well. I've just come off of a 5 day long holiday with the family, so I'm
Oh, nice.
refreshed, relaxed, re-energized. I as soon as I got back, booted up Hellblade 2, played through it. Have some thoughts.
Yeah, I'm excited. I have not talked to you about your thoughts yet because I wanted to come into this conversation blind. You could come in and say, this game's horrible. You could come in and say this game's wonderful. I don't know which way this is gonna go. My thoughts are obviously out there. I dropped a review on Wednesday after the game came out. If you haven't checked that out, you can go check out that review for my high level thoughts. Even though I'm pretty sure most of you subscribed to this channel will have probably seen it. And then I also did a very in depth non-spoiler review discussion with Jam Pack Sam over at Project X Talk this week on Thursday. That is live now for everyone on the channel on audio feeds, so you can also go check that out. I have been engrossed in Hellblade 2 discussion. I'm finally able to talk in a spoiler way. So I'm excited. I got thoughts, as I said, a whole page worth of notes, ideas, theories, what's going on in this game. But before we get to all that, Sam, I gotta know your history with Hellblade. Did you play Hellblade 1? Did you like Hellblade 1?
I have played Hellblade 1. I didn't play it immediately upon release. I came to it probably a year and a half, maybe 2 years after it came out. But it always been on my radar. It was just one of those things that I never got to. So I played through it, platinumed it, as I always do with games
Nice.
on PlayStation. I can't necessarily say that I loved it, but I really, really liked it. I thought that, most of the sentiments that people share, that it was quite innovative in terms of its audio design, in terms of its approach and tackling of mental health issues. I felt like it was verging into a sector of Norse mythology that even things like God of War hadn't really broached on. So yeah, I was a big fan, and I was looking forward to Hellblade 2 as soon as it was announced alongside the Series X. Of course, gosh darn it, Xbox exclusive. Oh god, got to cross over enemy lines and play a game there. But yeah, I've been excited for a number of years to see how this turned out.
That's awesome. Well, as everyone knows, and I don't know, I'm sure you've heard me say this, but Hellblade, one of my favorite games of all time. I really fell in love with Senua as a character, her story in Hellblade 1, Senua's sacrifice, and just I never really got the complaints about the puzzles. Like, it was a action adventure game, and like I use action and air quotes because it does have combat, but it was more about the narrative, the storytelling, the puzzles that were the primary gameplay in that game. And I never found them like annoying. So it is one of my favorite games of all time. I loved it. So I've been super excited for this. Obviously, I woke up at 4 a.m. to play Hellblade 2. I literally had an alarm set for 3:59 a.m. So I hopped out of bed. My girlfriend was, a funny story. My girlfriend was sick. So, and I had soccer that night. So I got back at literally like 11:30 at night, showered, maybe a bed by midnight. So I was like, I'm going to get 4 hours of sleep. She was like, don't wake me up. Like, I'm taking NyQuil. I don't feel well. Can you just like sleep on the couch? I'm like, I'm not going to sleep much anyway. So that sounds fine to me. So I ran upstairs looking at reviews. I'm like, what's going on? What's going on? Like, what's everyone feeling? Little surprised it didn't score high. Like I would have expected it to score higher than the first one, given like the more resources Ninja Theory had. But I don't personally like review scores aren't going to make like influence me either way. Like I'm going to go into my own narrative and see for myself. And I do feel that there has been sort of a tainted discussion around this game, which you see if you go check out some comment sections. But Sam, let's talk about Hellblade 2. I want your overall high-level thoughts about the game. You beat it this morning, if I'm remembering correctly.
Yeah, it would have been early this afternoon for me,
for
but
you.
morning
Yes.
for you. So I am a few hours off. So I'm coming in pretty hot.
Hmm.
So I am gonna give myself the range that my opinion may change slightly once I've settled more on it. But I feel relatively sure in where my opinion lies.
Okay.
Um, this is it's so interesting because the tendency of a number of people online is to attach the wider context of the Xbox ecosystem on this title.
Hmm.
And I think that to the credit of those people, there is stuff that you can't really ignore. But I think that you're also doing a disservice by not just focusing on the game itself. I think logical, reasonable people can understand that, but I understand that there is a vitriol and hyperbole built up at the minute around Xbox, and this game needs to deliver, yada yada yada. Does this fit in with what they seem to want from first party now, etc., etc.? Which I think those are valid concerns, and plenty of people have already touched on that. We may end up touching on it, but for the game itself, I have said in the Discords, but I'll reiterate for people who haven't yet joined, please join the Discord. I do think, in the most non-toxic way possible, besides visuals, I prefer Hellblade 1 in almost every aspect.
Hmm.
I think whether you're talking about combat or puzzles or the narrative, I think whilst Hellblade 2 is obviously like drop dead stunning, I'd say it's alongside, and I'm not trying to do a comparison, but like it sits in my mind alongside Horizon Forbidden West
I said
as
the same thing on
the
Xbox
best
this week.
looking
Yeah,
games on
yeah,
console right now. Certainly the best looking game on Xbox
yeah. Hmm.
easily. And I would say that this probably does trump Horizon in terms of pure fidelity, but obviously one is a linear game, one is open world. So there's comparisons to draw there. I've been trying to make my opinion as concise as possible.
Hmm.
So what I've managed to boil it down to is that I've heard a lot of people, like you were suggesting, in comment sections on videos across the internet right now, saying that Hellblade 2 is a tech demo.
Yeah.
Of course, we can kind of understand what people mean when they say that, but they're being disingenuous when they say it,
Hmm.
because tech demos are meant to, be showcases for what the console can do, and that is by proxy what Hellblade 2 is doing. But you're dismissing a lot of stuff there. What I would say, I'm going to refine that comment that I've heard a lot so that I think it's closer to reality, at least in my opinion. Hellblade 2 isn't a tech demo, it's a launch game. And I mean that in the best ways and in the worst ways,
Hmm.
because launch games are shorter experiences that are meant to be, more so than anything else, technical showcases for what the new hardware can do. And more often than not that it's a rule, but typically those launch titles are relatively vapid is the wrong word, but devoid of meaningful content and gameplay in a wider sense. I think in an alternate reality where Senua's Saga released as a launch title for the X and S, I think general sentiment will be much kinder to it.
I was going to ask you
Um,
that if this came out 4 years ago instead of 4 years into the generation, would
yeah,
we be looking at a situation where people are more blown away by something like the visuals,
yeah,
even though the other gameplay mechanics aren't as strong? Which I do agree with you
yeah.
on that point. By the way, I do think, and we'll dive into those things deeper,
Hmm.
but I wonder if when Xbox reveals it 2019 for the series, actually get that little gameplay trail, or you get that little CGI trailer.
Hmm.
I wonder if it comes out the next year with the console and people are blown away, if suddenly they're looking back at Hellblade 2 really fondly instead of more of a divisive game, which it seems to be right now.
Yeah, yeah. I think that is totally right. I think you know, fairly or unfairly to the game itself, again, which we do have to detach from all of this context, I think that there is a world where Hellblade 2 is the kickoff to this generation and showcases what's possible on this hardware, a good sign of things to come. I think, you know, the shortcomings in terms of like gameplay specifically that this game has would be more forgivable to some people. And also, you know, by proxy, it would mean that it would have only come out a few years after Senua's sacrifice. So therefore, there wouldn't have been that much waiting involved. And I think that the wait is something that has brought down a lot of people's opinions on the game because it's a short experience, right? And we've seen trailers over multiple years, and it's sort of, I think perspectives have changed because when it was first announced, I think I don't want to speak out of turn. I think the general sentiment was that they were probably going to expand in scope. That it wasn't necessarily going to be a 30, 40-hour game, but that it was going to be, you know, more fleshed out and a bit more built up and a little more expansive, maybe a little more, what's the word? Doesn't matter. They were just going to step things up. They were going to try and push the boat more across the board. And that obviously didn't really pan out. And they said, no, it's going to be the same length pretty much as Senua's Sacrifice. It's going to be, you know, the same. We're not going to divert too much from what we've done already. And that did set expectations, but I still think that some people, including myself, were just maybe hoping for a little bit more than what we ended up getting.
I would have loved, in retrospect, hindsight obviously 2020, but I would have loved after the first Hellblade trailer, we got some sort of discussion from the studio, from Xbox, really setting those expectations because it did become the narrative of, hey, Hellblade 2 clearly, like they and I want to make this very clear. I see people say they had over $100 million in 7 years to make this game.
Yeah.
They did not make this. They did not start making Hellblade 2 in 2017. They made Bleeding Edge, which came out 2019. Like when they revealed this game, they had barely started working on it. So this is not a 7-year development cycle. This is a 4 to 5 year development cycle, which whether you think that is too long for the final product, that is your prerogative. Sure. But I did see, like, and maybe I was guilty of it too, throughout the build-up, people expecting a sort of God of War renaissance for Hellblade. Like this is going to be our God of War, because obviously the Norse mythology comparisons are so clear right there. Like they could have something like that. So if Ninja Theory had come out and said something like, hey guys, it's going to be more Hellblade, I think immediately the hype might have gone down, but people's expectations were then in line, instead of telling us after the developer direct a few months ago, which I don't know if that ultimately hurt the game's hype. And we've talked about marketing for weeks now. I know you've written in with questions. So that's just a whole, I don't know if they've set this game up for major success.
Yeah, I think it's just that maybe, and of course, like we've, not only you, but all of us here on the channel have talked about in various degrees how the strategy at Xbox has shifted, not only pre-ABK from the 2018-2019 period, but also definitely post-ABK, as we all know. So I think that maybe in between there, not that it's excusing it in any way, that the strategy shifted, timelines almost certainly moved around, especially with COVID kicking in. And I think that, like you say, expectations, I don't think were set either early enough or at all until the last minute. And then some people that were expecting this big thing felt shortchanged because it's coming out in a couple of months, but you've been hyping us up with trailer after trailer for years. And realistically, you know, people are now saying, is there actually anything left that you haven't already shown?
They showed way too much of the game, in my opinion. Like they
in retrospect,
you again,
play through it and you're like, we haven't seen maybe 2 things in this game. Everything else we've definitely seen.
Especially when you get towards the end, I was like, I've seen this whole, like, this is the Game Awards.
Yeah,
I saw this.
Literally the first bit of gameplay you showed is like one of the final set pieces. Oh, interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
But But yeah, like, so I think, again, fairly or unfairly to Hellblade 2, it is in a unique and challenged position in various degrees. But I think that TLDR, I prefer Hellblade 1, but I think that Hellblade 2 is still a good experience. I don't know how good of a game it is, and I think that's something that I'm going to have to sit on. But as an audio visual experience, it's close to unparalleled, even if the story didn't engage me as much as I was actually really hoping for. So yeah, it's going to be an interesting talk.
Yeah. So I obviously agree with you on the visual fidelity standpoint. I think this is the most gorgeous game, and that's you played it on Series S. You have,
Yes,
yeah.
so it
So
was a little bit muddier for me, I think, than the crispness of an X or PC.
well, if my gameplay clips that I took from my Xbox and then rendered in lower resolution or anything to go by, I'm like, it really does an injustice to play it not on an X or a PC,
Yeah.
because the game is so stunning to look at. Everything from the rocks, the grass, just the human faces, the emotion that is expressed through every character in this game. I've never seen anything like it. It's genuinely like that is what I expect from like a next gen experience, as we're talking about. Like if we can get games that want to be that photorealistic, giving those sort of performances, then the games in the future are going to be amazing. I will
Yeah.
say that not everything is next gen in this game. And obviously, I want to start with the combat. A big
Hmm.
talking point of the first one was the combat's not that great.
Yeah.
And we both got the 100%. I've said this before. I do think the combat in Hellblade 1 might not be better, but is more fun as a
Yes.
game to play. And I say that because the combat in Hellblade 2 is more realistic, I think, is more visceral, which is the word being thrown around, but the brutality on display there for these combat sequences. Like it's hard to swing a sword. You get tired. Senua shows you that. Like it is exhausting when she's dodge rolling. Like these things are realistic how you would expect when you're in sort of this life and death combat situation. But in my video game,
Hmm.
I think Hellblade 1 was a much more enjoyable experience, even though you were often surrounded by enemies that could attack you from behind, and the voices would try to warn you.
Yeah.
But like sometimes you couldn't move the camera fast enough to see them. You didn't have as many maybe defensive options except parrying. But the parrying in Hellblade 1 is so much easier. Like even if they're behind you, you'll just cut to the animation of you parrying. This one, the timing window is so small for parrying. It's actually frustrating to a level degree. Like I
Mm.
often would just dodge instead of trying to parry, and I found that I would then not have my focus time available often, like nowhere near as much as you do in the first game. Like the
Yeah.
first game, I would be able to slow down time and hack up multiple enemies. This one is like maybe two enemies in a combat sequence I would get focus for. So I really felt like I had to save that for like those big annoying enemies.
Mm. Yeah. It's Hellblade 2 is one of the most unique sequels I've probably ever seen in that regard, because typically, and this is probably going to sound like I'm dunking on the game more than I mean to, but typically the general consensus that we understand in anything, not just games but just media, is that sequels will refine the good and fix the
Mm-hmm.
bad. And Senua Saga doesn't really do that.
Mm-hmm.
It takes what was good in Hellblade 1, which in my opinion would be the visuals and the audio. Not that visuals were necessarily like top tier back in the day when
For an
Sacrifice came
indie
out.
game, though, at the time.
Exactly,
Yes.
exactly. They took those and ramped them up to 11, both of which are certainly the high points, and I think
Mm-hmm.
what is unanimously being praised across the board, as it
Yep.
should. But as a consequence of ramping those up to such an nth degree, most other things that actually kind of needed improving have kind of fallen by the wayside and actually kind of rotted a little bit and receded back from where they were. which is a choice, and it's very clearly Ninja Theory's vision. They've talked about making the fights more cinematic, which they are, and the game is in general, both literally and figuratively in terms of interactivity. But yeah, I can't say that I think the trade-off was worth it, but it doesn't change the fact that whatever fights came up in Senua Saga were still, I'm not going to say engaging, but they were riveting. They were sort of, heart pumping, and I felt it seems rote because so many people are saying it, but it did feel like I was only just making it through most of the fights.
I died more in Hellblade 2 than I did probably in my entirety, like all 3 of my playthroughs of Hellblade 1 combined, because I found this was a much tougher experience, and I did keep it on that dynamic difficulty, so when I was doing well, they would punish me more. So
Yeah. So like, of course, it's all subjective. I've seen plenty of takes say that they prefer the combat in this because it is more visceral, and they say, in real life it is difficult to swing a sword, and it's like, yeah, that's all true, and if it works for you, that's great. But I think that if this game had the combat system of Hellblade 1, it would be demonstrably better.
I would agree with you. Especially there's one thing in particular with the combat that I miss so much, and that is the kick option. The ability to kick and break defenses or do a running flying knee was something I utilized constant. Like, I just replayed this game in January in preparation. So like, I'm very familiar with like how it felt, all the options you had. And when I went into it, I go, I can't do that anymore, huh? I can literally
Yeah.
swing my sword fast or swing it really slow. And I got to be honest, I found the heavy attack absolutely useless because most of the before I even got it off, the enemies would hit me.
Interesting.
I literally
I
just slashed them.
I to be fair, I was slashing most of the time, but particularly like you're talking about the kick of where I missed it the most when the shield enemies come in. The basic slashes do essentially nothing. So what I found, and I only found this really within maybe the last hour of gameplay in Saga, was that I was quite efficiently, to be fair, to the game's credit, like rhythmically switching between the light and the heavy, so that I was not necessarily like fully stun locking enemies, but I was managing to, like if for a shield enemy, for example, you do the heavy and it sort of swings the shield out and then you can get some hits in. I managed to sort of keep them in that state, and as soon as they pulled the shield back up, I had another heavy lined up to open them back up again. Obviously that isn't as effective when they're like the more brutish enemies that can just take the hits and don't really stagger at all. But yeah, no, I think it's weird because even like, I don't know if I'm misremembering, so correct me because you've played it more recently than I have. I feel like I remember there being like more variety in the attacks if you were like executing them coming out of a dodge or something in Hellblade 1. I don't know if that's correct or not, but I feel like you could do like a dodge attack where if you dodge and then attack, it's a unique animation that sort of comes in from the side, like a slash.
Yeah, no, you can do that. Yeah.
Okay.
No, yeah,
That's
for sure.
something else that I missed. The undeniably more cinematic, but I feel that the options you have and the versatility isn't there. So I kind of, not button mashing through every encounter, but I felt like I didn't have to switch up my strategy for any enemy in the game.
I will say that I shield enemies and then those fire enemy, like the big fire guys, were the ones I would save my focus for because I
Yeah.
found those to be the most annoying ones in the game. And there's different enemy variety in this, I think, compared to the first game. Like, I will praise them, like they did add a few more unique types of enemies, where in the first one it was kind of just the same ones over and over and over again. One thing I do want to bring up is, I don't know if you experience this, but if you use your focus time when an enemy is throwing something at you, whether it's a spear or a hatchet, Senua will grab it and throw it back at them.
I did not experience that. No.
Yeah, that is dope. That is, it's
Okay. Yeah.
clearly situational, but
Of course.
once you like, you can tell like, oh wow, they put that much thought. And like, there are parts of the combat where it's like there was a lot of thought put into this, and whether you appreciate it or it feels good to play, like it's clearly something they spent a lot of time making their vision of.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think the interesting thing specifically about enemy variety is, again, I'm certainly not as fresh off of Sacrifice as you are, but I think the trade-off there, because it does feel like the game, the things that it's improved, has traded something else off as a result. I'm again, I could be completely wrong, but I feel like my memory is correct. There were actual like boss fights in Sacrifice.
There were bosses, and which is something I wanted to mention because I do feel that well, this is a spoiler. The boss encounters here are the giants, which aren't really bosses. They're more cinematic, set pieces, as opposed to something like Sacrifice, where it was, hey, you got the bird god that you have to kill, you got the fire god you have to kill to unlock the door. Like there were more bosses with unique gameplay mechanics, like the bird would become invisible or do like a spin attack at you, right? Like, and you don't see that in this game. So
yeah,
a little disappointing. That, like, I did expect that. The only real, I would say, boss fight is Alfir at the end, like the last, and even then, that's not really that much of a like he's bigger and he has like a rage mode, but no real cool like unique mechanics to him.
Yeah, because like I don't want to jump the gun, but just specifically because we're talking about that encounter, I almost felt like there was going to be, clearly in some kind of split of Senua's psyche, the sentiment that, you know, he was a giant, and that halfway through the fight he would transform into some kind of giant type thing that you then had to fight. But obviously he stays, which again, like thematically makes perfect sense. But I felt like it would be an interesting inversion that you're fighting the giants and they sort of end up not being what you thought, and then you've got a thing that you think you know what it is and it's actually the other thing. But you know, it's okay. Again, it's all a matter of taste. I think that there is an argument to be made that this is more refined. I think other people will just view it that it's been dumbed down, and both opinions are valid.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, for sure. More refined, but not more fun to play is how I've been describing it. Which is, if you want to view it as art, fine. But if you want like a fun gameplay experience, might be detrimental to you. So why don't we talk about the puzzles next? Speaking of elements that they dumbed down, because oh boy, do I think the puzzles in this game are so rudimentary. I think they have been, I don't want to say nerfed, but they've been simplified, and that's not a good, it's not a good thing in my opinion, because there are very memorable puzzles to me in Sacrifice where the one I always go back to is the gate puzzles, where you have to walk in and out of gates to change reality, to make the stairs to go up. And like those puzzles to me are great. I know, and I've expressed a sentiment before, I don't know what happened to whether it's a new generation of gamers or people have just gotten old and they value their time, but nobody likes to figure out puzzles anymore. Puzzles have gotten so much flack and hatred, and people act like they're above puzzle solving. And when I see that, I'm like, you just don't want to use your brain. You just don't want to think. You just want things handed to you like instant gratification. And that frustrates me. And I think what we see in Hellblade 2 is a direct result of the feedback they got from 1, where people are like, you know, we don't really like spending all this time on puzzles. And so they're like, okay, well, we still want the puzzles as a part of her psychosis, but what if everything's just kind of right there given to you and you don't have to think about it? You just have to go through the motions and solve them. So I can't, like, they add new puzzle types too, like the one we have to change change reality where it shifts the land, and but even then, like, whatever order you think, you probably, like, you could probably spin in a circle and be like, I'm gonna do this one, this one, this one, and it'll probably make you the path. That's how simple it is.
Yeah, yeah. Like, I think because we've touched on them first, like the combat and the puzzles are the two things that most people seem to have qualms with. And like, they admittedly, because I've seen some people say this as a defense, is that the combat and puzzles were similarly relatively bare bones, not that great in Sacrifice. But again, going back to the whole general sentiment around sequels thing, you expect them, that's the foundation laid, they're going to build off, hit the ground running and develop it further. And they don't. I think that they, like you said, they maybe listened to the feedback from Sacrifice and learnt the wrong lessons. I think rather than varying up the puzzles, making them more compelling, because I think, like, not that I necessarily class it as a puzzle, certainly not in the reality shifting way, but I think if there was something more puzzle like that was along the lines of the stone faces that actually had you not necessarily like stunted and having to just stop your gameplay and have a look around and, you know, pick up a thing and take it to a thing and then pick up another thing and take it to the thing, where you're actively having to observe your environment. And that would, because that's what the stone face is meant to do. I don't know how well they succeed in doing it, but where you like Senua are questioning things that you're seeing in your environment and whether
I
they
did it
actually
all the
are.
time. I mentioned it on X Talk this week. There were multiple times where I was like, those two rocks look like eyeballs. And I'm like staring, just like, I'm like, they're just rocks. Like, I gotta keep playing the game.
Yeah. And like, that is conceptually very cool. And I think that there is ground to explore something there. I don't know exactly what that looks like, but I think that, yeah, like you say, you can see the solution to the puzzle a mile off, but basically almost before the puzzle was even technically started. And that's not good, because then, again, going into another criticism, it bleeds too close to the padding side of things for me, where I feel like you're not necessarily wasting my time, but you're wasting the run time that you have allocated to tell this story. And I feel like, particularly in that middle section where you're exploring through the caves, whilst there is some interesting narrative content there, I don't know that the gameplay of the puzzle solving and lighting the fires and switching the realities really sustains that for as
That's
long as
my
it goes
least
on.
favorite section in this game. Can I just say, like,
Yeah.
I thought it was way too long, and just being in the caves for that long did get tiresome. Which
Mhm.
we'll talk about, but it's not that I think the puzzles are even bad. They're just too simple, and it
Yeah.
does lean towards that where in Sacrifice I felt, okay, they're trying to include these in the narrative, and I felt that. I didn't often feel that these were narrative focused puzzles, especially the first time you come up to the pedestal puzzle where it's like, shift the rock, get these orbs and put them in the, I'm like, okay, this just seemed like you saw a random bird feeder and you're like, I gotta put something in here. It genuinely, I was like, I'm not really sure what like the theme is you're going for with this puzzle.
Mhm.
And I don't think that was conveyed very well, because they simplify, like, if there was some sort of more difficult, like thought provoking element to the puzzle, then maybe they could have explored some sort of narrative. But I don't know if you've also noticed when you were doing the puzzles, but like the voices, they now just kind of tell you the solution. And I didn't particularly like that, because it reminds me of a lot of things I criticized PlayStation first party for, where
Atreus.
yeah, Atreus, Aloy yelling at me like, "What if I jump over there?" Like, we've had that, and it goes back to my big criticism of like, when did we all just want our hands held and be spoon? Like, why put them in there if you're just going to spoon fed? And I don't think it's as egregious as some of those examples, but it does get annoying. Like, there's the one at the end where you see the glowing blue character running around.
Mhm.
I jumped off like the wrong side, and they were like, we have to go over there. I'm like, well, thank you, Mister, or like Miss Obvious. Like, obviously, why do you think I jumped down here? Yeah, frustrating.
Yeah. I mean, I'm right there with you. I'm famously a very big fan of puzzle and deduction in games. Yeah, I don't know. Like, I think that the crux of it for me is that it becomes padding, because, like, you'd make a very good point actually, that because even I can kind of remember that in Sacrifice they felt more consequential and like intentionally placed at specific points in the narrative. And I feel like there was a way of maybe I'm speaking as if I'm a game designer and I know what to do. I don't. But like in my head, you could have the same pedestal puzzle, but you would kind of have to seed the idea of the hidden folk beforehand, so that it didn't just feel like, oh, I'm now approaching a new mechanic that doesn't really make any sense, that Senua would really know what to do with it. But I think that if you had integrated it into the narrative a little bit more of illusions, or maybe maybe even conceptually in a few early cinematics, you had some of those like spectral figures in the background doing things, and Senua would flick her eyes and catch it and not comment on it or say anything, but the idea that she is noticing things and sort of paying attention. And you could even then have the Furies comment on that as if, what's she looking at? Or you know, what's that thing doing?
Yep.
Exactly. So I think that there is something that could be done there. It's just that nothing feels quite as cohesive as it did in the first game.
Yeah, I have some theories, because I do think ultimately there is a very compelling narrative here that I don't think is as good. Well, I don't know if it's not as good, but it's not as well told to the player, right? Like the first game, obviously, there's a lot of metaphors, narrative. Like, it's not just, oh, we're going to kill a god in hell. To like, there is more to it than that. Like, you have to read into a lot of the things that are implied through what's happening, and there is that in this game as well, which I think a lot of people are kind of just taking this at face value of like, this is Senua's journey of gathering friends, killing giants, and I'm like, that's not really the story of Hellblade 2. And I think that's getting lost, and whether that is a failure of Ninja Theory to convey bigger, more important narrative to the player, I don't know, but we can talk about that. I asked for questions from the Discord, and Ghostly March wrote in and says, do you think the commentary on mental health is in this game is as good as the first? Which will transition over to our as we leave the puzzle section, the story. So mental health, big part of the first game. Do you think this game tackles it nearly as well as the first?
No. And I think I don't want to speak out of turn. I feel like that's pretty obvious if you've played through both games. But I think that's also, it's so interesting and difficult to really quantify, because inherently Senua's Sacrifice is an introspective personal journey for Senua alone. And as far as I can remember, for the entirety of the game, she is on her own. So it like inherently inherently more of the runtime can be attributed and allowed for the mental health side of things, particularly because of how emotional her journey is in terms of trying to reclaim Dillian's soul. I feel like that inherently allows Hellblade 1 to be more overt and nuanced in its take on mental health. Or at least, nuanced is the wrong word, because I think that arguably Hellblade 2 is more nuanced and more subtle with it. I think Hellblade 1 is inherently going to be viewed by many as having the better depiction of mental health, which I think I would still agree with, because it's telling a story that we haven't necessarily seen in games all that much, but it is a story of mental health that we are all quite familiar with.
That's what I
of
was gonna bring up. I think Senua's Sacrifice might have a story that's easier for most players to relate to because it is
mm,
about the acceptance of a loved one being gone, right? And there's
yeah,
nothing you can do to get that back. And I think most people can relate to that feeling. They understand what Senua's going through. They don't understand quite the psychosis and everything that she's seeing as she goes on that journey of acceptance, and understanding that, like, hey, I can't save Dillian. So this one, I do think there are mental health themes, and I will talk about those as we go through the chapters because I do think there's a lot of hidden meaning behind a lot of the things in here. So for the player to understand, I think Hellblade 1 is easier to get from a mental health perspective, but I think both games do a good job of tackling mental health.
yeah. I think that Hellblade 2, again, coming very hot off of it, I think it's just more inherently because you are opening up to a more extroverted journey with an ensemble, so to speak, of other characters. Less time can be explicitly spent on the mental health stuff because you have other characters interacting. I know the Furies are talking most of the time, but I think that therefore, either intentionally or otherwise, the mental health side of things is still present, but it's more of a backseat thing.
Mm.
And alongside that, and I think it's important to note, I get why people might feel it this way. The sentiment I've kind of picked up on from some people, even if they haven't explicitly said it, is that they kind of just wanted the same thing from Sacrifice again,
Mm.
of Senua really struggling and fighting against the Furies and having the back and forth and I get that because that was great in Sacrifice. It was
But
one of the
that's
best
not
bits
that
of
would
Sacrifice.
undermine the entire first game.
Precisely. And the point is, and you should understand this from how Sacrifice ends, that she is inherently, as anybody would if they've overcome, demons or mental health struggles or whatever, they'd be more in tune with themselves, with whatever condition they have, and therefore inherently the way that they interact with that condition or the way that they interact with the world itself and the people in it, that it is going to be different.
Mhm.
I said quite a few times already, sequels having to evolve and sort of expand, and that is what happens to Senua here. I think it's just people, I don't know, maybe wanted the character growth but didn't want to lose the constantly at odds with yourself, because it's more internal, right? Because that you have the two voices, one being more doubtful, one being more
Mhm.
confident. So the conflict is still there, but it's all internal, and it's less about Senua interacting with the Furies and more about Senua defying the Furies and still interacting with the people in front of her to connect.
Yeah.
I think that that's what people are missing.
Yeah.
Whether that's executed well, that's a different question, of course.
Mhm.
But I think that people still need to be cognizant of that.
Yeah, because at the end of the first game, like, she's accepted her psychosis. Like, she's like, "This is a part of me."
Mm-hmm.
So, when we pick up here, and you do have, like you said, the Furies that one is often in combat, they're like, "Oh, he's just such a better fighter than you," or like, "Oh, he's really good," or like, "You gotta hit him harder." Like, you occasionally have the one voice pumping you up and then the other one trying to bring you down, and that's often that I think that is a very good depiction of mental health struggles where you have inner turmoil, but you also have things that you feel confident. You're like, the one voice says, like, "You're a good fighter, Senua, like, you can take them, like, you understand
Mm-hmm.
these things." So I think they do a good job, but it is different than the first one. If you go in expecting it to just be like she's gonna be at war with herself again, I don't I don't know if you're going to get the same story that you were looking for.
And also, people complain that or I don't want to say everything, that a lot of things in Senua Saga become repetitive very fast. And I would say, well, if you wanted the same thing from Sacrifice in terms of her mental health depiction, that would also become repetitive
Mhm.
very fast. And it'd just be well worn ground in the same way that you complain about the combat and the puzzles. So at least they are doing something different. Whether you like it or not, that is a completely different question. And just whilst we're at it, before we move on, the one thing I would criticize about the Furies is that I felt more often than I'd like, they kind of undermined what was going on in terms of conversations between Senua and other characters, because they were kind of, again, in Sacrifice, they were sort of toying and tormenting and playing with Senua. Whereas now they are more in tune with Senua, they are slightly more co-aligned and on the same page, but a lot of their commentary is on the external stuff, on the characters and the world. And I felt like they were doing a little too much tell, don't show, where they kind of would repeatedly state the obvious when conversations were happening. Of, he's angry, he doesn't trust us. It's sort of like I could. Your facial capture is so excellent that I kind of would have preferred to have let myself deduce a character's intention or what they were truly feeling, because I can tell from how good the facial capture is. I felt like maybe the Furies at times kind of undercut that by serving everything up to you in the same way that you were saying, like the puzzles were simplified to make it maybe more accessible for players. I don't know. Maybe there is something there in terms of a criticism that they are trying to make this as accessible a story as possible, as well as a game. And therefore less and less is being asked of the player, both physically as player, but also mentally as somebody who is engaging with any given scene. Because I kind of felt like whether you're talking about Astrid or Thorgester or someone, I was like, oh yeah, he looks a bit suspect at this point, or she very clearly doesn't believe what she's saying, and then the Furies would say the same thing. I was like, what? Was that necessary? I'm not sure, but that's a personal taste thing more than anything, I think.
No, I think I understand what you're saying, and I've heard some complaints about people saying that the Furies talk over a lot of the story beats too.
I didn't mind that.
And I didn't mind that either, because like that is when people are talking to me, like when you were just talking, I have thoughts running in my head.
Exactly.
So it's like a normal human thing to do, whether it's like thinking of a response or trying to interpret. And that's just how Senua's like the Furies are her mental state, interpreting what she's hearing, what she's seeing. So I don't really get that criticism. I do think there is something to you saying like they undermine a lot of what like there's at the end of the forest in chapter 6, right? Or chapter 5. Is that chapter 5? One of the last chapters. You go through that forest, and then at the end, it's like, oh, which one are you going to choose? Fardramir or whatever, and Astria. I can't say these weird names. Senua was the only one I got in Thorgester. All right. But I chose Astrier.
So did I.
Just because I was like, oh, I like her as a character. But as soon as I did, the Fear's like, you're choosing her, and I'm like, what do you have a problem with her? Like, I don't understand. Like, you told me I had to choose, but then nothing came of that. So I really felt like there was going to be some sort of payoff. Like, did the other character die in this moment? Is it suddenly like this choice matters? And it ultimately didn't. So I didn't really understand what the point in that doubt of Senua was, because it didn't lead to anything. It didn't enhance anything. It was just literally like yelling at you for making an inconsequential choice.
Yeah.
Very strange. Very strange. But overall, as we've said, audio design phenomenal throughout the game. Yes.
Yep.
Let's deep dive through the story chapter by chapter. I have a big theory I'm going to share at the end, but I want to get through the actual story first. So starts with a recap of Sacrifice. If you haven't played the game, I recommend go doing it. You can knock it out in just a few hours, just like this game. But Senua is now aboard a ship. She has let herself be captured by the slavers that are enslaving her people, the Northmen. And then they have a boat crash, and Senua ends up in the water, breaks free, gets on land. She's really messed up. She got blood pouring out of her head. And this is about a 40-minute sequence of her being hurt and slowly like walking through this beach until she finally like finds some of the slave men and kill them. And the last one being Thorgester, that she fights in combat, but she doesn't kill him. I I don't know if we needed like 40 minutes of just walking to start. I don't know if that's the best way to start the game. I'm fine with it because I was in no matter what with the experience. Like I love just being back in the world, but you're going to lose a lot of players in that opening section, I think.
Yeah. I again, I'm very hot off of it, but even whilst playing it, I had a thought that seems obvious to me that would help with the pacing of that opening section, but obviously they didn't do that. To me, the obvious choice is because the whole conceit is that the Northmen have captured her people, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, why not have the opening of the game be the Northmen raiding her village? And you can have combat there and you can see people being taken away. And then you have the idea of her getting on the boat and
Letting
then
herself be
crashing.
she could let herself be captured. Like we could
Yeah.
choose to like lay down our sword or whatever.
Yeah. It seems strange to me to go from the end of Sacrifice, how that concludes, to then just being told that her people have been captured by these Northmen. I feel like not only would that have been a really cool, like set PC type thing to splash open the game with, really wow you from the offset, but it would also help lead into that slower segment. So you, rather than starting the game off with a lull into a high, you have a high, then a little bit of a lull as you're walking and recovering, as you do in many games where you're
Mm-hmm.
wounded and you're shuffling along. That's
Yep.
fine. And then have the combat pick back up. I feel like that to me is like a clear choice, not only narratively but gameplay wise as well.
This opening relies on the player understanding that the Northmen have been capturing her people because that's mentioned in the first game. Like that's not a
Mm-hmm.
new narrative beat. Like if you play the first game, you know that's something that's going on. Like they killed Dillian, like they
Yeah,
ripped him apart essentially. Like so that's not a new narrative beat, but to have her suddenly like, why did she choose to let herself get captured? Is all like there is a question here. Like, okay, she accepted that she couldn't save Dillian, and then her next thing was, I'm gonna go be the savior of my people, essentially.
yeah. In a weird way, and I'm not trying to draw comparisons for comparison's sake. In an interesting way, and I literally just popped into my head, it's kind of similar to the way that God of War 3 ended, and then God of War 2018 starts, and you just have no context for how he ended up there.
Oh, yeah, why is he in Norse mythology now? Yeah,
It's like he's in Greece and he accepts who he is, and spoilers for God of War 3, he sacrifices himself, essentially. And then 2018 starts and he's got a son and he's in a different place, and there's just no explanation.
yeah. Mm-hmm.
Like, you can have the suspension of disbelief as a player that you're often required to do that. So it's okay to do that here. But there are surely very clear and not, I would say, not that hard ways of at least tangentially bridging that gap a little bit better. But, you know, like, I agree that the opening section drags, but
It drags till you get to gameplay because there are like if you're just giving me a sword, maybe 20 minutes in instead of 40
yeah.
minutes in, right? Because I think there are interesting things throughout. Like you see the Northmen fighting the survivors. Like one falls off a cliff, one just gets killed. Like,
Mm-hmm.
and then you hear the psychosis, obviously, but you hear like their screams as they're dying, like people begging to be saved, and obviously like none of that's real, but she thinks it is because like that's what would it be happening in this situation. Most of them probably just drowned out at sea, and that's the remnants of the boat crash. But like
Yeah.
there are interesting things happening that are from a narrative perspective really interesting, but from a gameplay perspective, I do find the opening a little slow.
And I think, like, in a way, that might suggest that the opening of Hellblade 2 is, and this seems like an obvious statement to make, is more designed for people that know what Hellblade is going in.
That's how I felt. Yeah.
Because if you know that Hellblade is a slower paced, more narrative experience, you won't be necessarily as off put as somebody jumping in for the first time playing Hellblade 2 with no context, wow, this is slow, I don't know, this is kind of boring. But if you know that those are the kind of expectations you should have, I think that it's, again, this sounds worse than I mean it, but it's more tolerable to get through the slow start.
Well, how many people are going to boot this up on Game Pass and play for 20 minutes and realize I haven't hit the X button. I've only held forward and like the sprint button essentially.
Yeah.
Which I think just sucks, because like when you get past that, the game does become, it opens up puzzles, combat encounters. Like it's just that opening. So you decide not to kill Thorgester because he's like, I can lead you to, and I brought up some words here, Borgar Vicky. I am so bad at this. All right. I don't know if it's just because I'm an American, but he says I can bring you there. Like, well, that's where my father is. He's in charge of rounding up all the slaves. Like, we're doing this because of him, right? And then she's like, all right, fine. Well, you're my slave now. And then something I do love what they do in this game is at the end of every chapter, like you get a zoom out of the entirety of the land, and then like the sun and the moon change in the sky, and then you're in a new location, like real time. It's not like, oh, like we're gonna put a loading screen here. You pop up here, and I think that's really, it keeps you immersed throughout the story, I think.
Yeah, and again, I'm not trying to draw comparisons, but it did feel
in God of War 3
inspired by God of War, with the one shot camera. And I'm pretty sure that there are cuts in the game, but overall that's the sort of vibe I got, which again lends itself quite well, because the idea of in God of War 2018, which kind of pioneered it, at least in the modern era, it was to immerse you as much as possible without breaks from the narrative. And for as narrative driven as this game is, it makes sense as well. And it also doubles up that it allows showing off of the tech and just how gorgeous some of the landscape and visuals can be. So I agree. I really enjoyed them as well.
Yeah. So Thorgester brings you to one of their settlements. Unfortunately, the settlement has been taken over by the Draugr, which is they're cannibals, right? Like I assumed that's what they were like eating people.
Yeah, well, like traditionally Draugr are,
they're in God of War though, right? Like they're Draugrs are.
I'm not trying to draw comparisons for
no, but if you played God of War, you know what the Draugr are.
Yeah, or like even stuff like Skyrim. Like Draugr traditionally are undead.
Okay.
But like I think that again, there could be something in the lore or a subtle piece of dialogue I didn't pick up on, but it did seem that they might not necessarily explicitly be undead, but more just like a cannibalistic kind of.
They were definitely cannibals.
Yeah, antiquated tribal faction. But then I guess it almost doesn't matter, because you could say that they are just cannibals, but Senua, through her perspective, sees them as something more monstrous,
as undead.
So I think either way it works, whichever read you have.
So she is like, Thorgester, stay here. I'm gonna go into this camp and I'm gonna save whoever I can in here. And I actually really like this area. I don't know if you did this, but I went into every single house I could, not just because I was also looking for runes and stuff, but there were very interesting narrative things going on. Like there's that one house where you hear the mother and the babies being killed. Like there are impactful moments. Like this village got massacred.
Yeah. And like I feel that was the first real moment that the game showed real potential to me. And that again, that sounds more negative than I mean it, but I think that particularly the crib, like you were saying, I think that I was like, oh, okay, no, they're seemingly really going to go there and do that kind of thing. And I don't know that anything else in the game necessarily hits that high, with maybe one exception, in terms of like storytelling in the environment. But yeah, it certainly left an impression.
So she makes her way through the camp, solving those puzzles. She eventually ends up at like the first of all, there's some mental illness stuff going on. Like she sees her dad, right? She sees her visions of her own home. She gets trapped in this imaginary forest, which I don't know if you understood this, but like there were multiple paths you could go.
Hmm.
And at first, I would just choose one and I go, and then I died and I would keep coming. I was like, what am I missing with this puzzle? And then I was like, oh, you don't run towards the red. If
Yeah.
so, I would just walk up, let the glass break, and then be like, this one's good. I'm gonna walk that
Is
way.
there red? Oh,
Yeah,
yeah.
because
Back
the
up.
red means her dad essentially,
Hmm.
and that would be giving into the doubts that he's putting into her mind, essentially. So she gets through all those things. She ends up at the Draugr ritual site, we'll call it, I guess. They're like
Hmm.
slaughtering everyone. They got Fragmir, whatever his name is, old man. They got the old man tied up, and they're gonna eat him. And Senua has, I'd say, probably the first big combat encounter here, where she enemy after enemy, and then ultimately you save him, and then you're like, let's get out of here because they summon the first giant of the game, Iltuga is, I think I got that one.
Hmm.
So she shows up, and you're like, we're piecing out. I can't fight a giant.
Yeah, like it's strange. I think that there's again, like I think things may settle for me, but it so many different things conflate together in terms of the short runtime kind of means that it has to run at a breakneck pace, but then there are long sections where the pacing feels off, where you're just
Mm-hmm.
walking and talking and solving puzzles. So I kind of feel like the core conceit of trying to get her people free from the Northmen, whilst it still technically is the overarching goal of her trying to get to Borgerverki or whatever it's called,
Yep.
that is still technically what she's striving towards throughout the game. But thematically, I know that there is content there in terms of the giants and hunting them down. But I kind of felt like that switch up in terms of immediate directive and goal happened very, very quickly.
I would agree
As
with
soon
that.
as she saved Fargrimmer, and I was like, oh, what? It's almost like the Fallout whole, you get sidetracked by random BS stuff. It's like, not to that extent, obviously, but it kind of feels like, well, why is Senua concerned with helping this person she's just found deal with the giant? I'm sure I am missing something. I don't want to, drag on that too much, but it did feel very jarring to me.
Mm-hmm. So I would agree, because like you hit the first chapter and you're like, oh, this is going to be a story about freeing her people, taking down slave traders, and then almost instantly they're like, it's actually about killing
Psych.
giants. And I'm like, okay, are the giants enslaving her people? Like, are we just what's yeah, so, and I say this knowing full well at the end, I think this does come together. Especially once I read my theories, I might keep teasing that, but I do think it comes together when, and I'll say this right now, but like the last chapter, when something happens, instantly the whole game essentially clicked for me. And I was like, seeing the Matrix, and I was like, I get it now. Like, I think you have to kind of play the whole game to understand like why all of this is going on, because it could have really just been like, I'm gonna go kill some slave traders, but there's more to it, in my opinion. So Fargrimmer, that's his name, Fargrimmer. I think that's how you pronounce it.
It
Old
is
man,
far grimmer.
Fargrimmer. Oh,
See
wow.
what you did there.
So Fargrimmer explains that the volcano erupted and that broke a hole between Midgar, where we are now. The last game was Helheim. Now we're in Midgar, and Jotunheim. Essentially, they call it Jotunheimer. Is that the official name? But
Mm-hmm.
Jotunheim, right? That's how we know it, Thor and everything.
Yeah.
Allowing the giants into the world, and that the slave traders, because he knows Thorgester and all and his people, are sacrificing to the giants to appease them. And that the only way to defeat the giants, well, he doesn't even know this, but he says, seek out the hidden folk. Senua. Like you, and something interesting here to note. Fargrimmer immediately says like, "You're special," essentially. Like I can see it. I know that you're the one that can take down these giants. I'm like, bro, we literally just met. What you're seeing is psychosis, and yeah. So I thought that was really interesting that they immediately wanted to like kind of elevate Senua to the savior role, not only in her eyes but everyone else's eyes.
Yeah, because it did. I don't know how explicit it was, because I'm sure that there's something that has flown over my head, but Fargrimmer certainly did seem sort of like the sage kind of, wise beyond his years kind of character. But when I certainly picked up on that, because he said, you're a seer, and you're here to save us all and stuff like that. I was like, well, something's going to come of that, surely, that he has a similar condition, or that there is going to be some recontextualization of what Senua's condition actually is, etc.
Yeah.
Which I'm sure we'll pick up on at some point. But yeah, I thought it kind of seems retroactively like maybe they were making a mountain out of a molehill, where it was more giving narrative justification as exposition to the player as to why Senua would be inclined to assist this person, like you said, that she just met, in solving
She's the
this
only
issue.
one that can do it. Like she now has that validation from this old man who we don't know, but seems to have an idea, an understanding of what's going on here.
Yeah.
So she seeks out the hidden folk in, honestly, my least favorite part of the game. And I'm not even saying it's bad. You just spend way too long in these caves. Like I don't like, and don't get me wrong, there's some beautiful sections in these caves. Like graphically, the puzzles are fine. Again, this is like we get introduced to the pedestal puzzle and the lighting the brazier fires. And this is also where I missed the most collectibles, which was frustrating because I had to go back to this chapter. But
Understandable.
yeah. So like you find out like the hidden folk who aren't real, by the way. Like you kind of pick that up if you're paying attention. Like the hidden folk were a myth that this village has kind of had, and the giant Iltuga, you learn her real name, which I don't know if I wrote it down here. Ingun.
Yeah.
You learn her real name was Ingun. She used to be a part of the village, but she was like, she gave her baby up to the hidden folk because she wanted to protect her baby, but there are no hidden folk, so her baby's just died. And Senua takes the baby's corpse and is like, I can defeat the giant now. Like, I'll give her back her baby, I'll say her real name, and that'll beat the giant. Which that makes sense in some reality. I if I was the giant, I would just smush you like a bug, but that's what she's going with. So we get our first sweet cinematic set piece after that. Like they summon the giant, you go into a volcano, and again, I was confused at first because I was like, oh, I have to hide behind the rocks because I just kept trying to run and then I would die, and I'm like, what am I doing wrong? And then I figured out after like 2 deaths, but this was, you have to free the giant from her chains because like she made a deal to become a giant, and like this is kind of just how she has to live her life. And then she dies after you give her baby and the real name. Like you kind of set her free from that guilt almost.
Yeah, I it's interesting, like sort of talking back about what we were saying about the lack of like boss fights. I think the set piece here and the other one are undeniably very impressive, and I think like the music that plays, what I guess it's music, but they're sort of like rising in intensity, sort of like boom, that
goes
kind
along
of thing.
with the
The flames coming. Yeah. That's all very cool, and I was like, oh no, me saying the thing in the village was the first thing that like really engaged me and be like, oh okay, that's interesting. this was like this was the first time I was like, oh no, okay, this is cool. This is cool. Whilst again, very, very, very simple mechanically, I think that everything came together enough where the environment comparison to everything we've seen thus far quite different. The intensity of the noise, the visuals, and what you actually had to do to get across, even though it was simple in layman's terms, it was different. So yeah, I liked it, and I think that I'm sure your theory may touch on it when we sort of circle back overall at the end, but there is some interesting like implications going on with what Senua is actually doing as opposed to what she is shown to be doing on screen. But yeah, I did thoroughly enjoy this section.
It's interesting because, like, again, this is the first time we've seen Senua interact with other people. So you're sitting there like, okay, she's killing a giant, but like, what is everyone else seeing? But then you get the Fargrimmer and Thorgester kind of being like, you did it, you killed a giant, and for what we know, like the game isn't really a fantasy world. Like all the fantasy elements are her psychosis. But
Yeah,
the fact that other characters are saying that they just saw something like mystical happen, you then like create like, is this actually a fantasy? Are there fantasy elements in this world? Is not everything she's seeing messed up? Like all just
yeah.
in her head. Um, so that's really an interesting way they went with the game, I thought. So now she's building a party. If this was an RPG, you'd start having, you got your mage, you got your warrior, um, Fargrimmer, Thorgester, Senua. They were like, let's go to bar uh, again. BV is what we're gonna call it. They are gonna keep
Going
on
to the
there.
place.
They're going to the place to tell, because apparently Fargrimmer knows Thorgester's dad, and it's like, we used to be homies. He'll understand. And once I say Senua can kill giants, we won't need these slave sacrifices anymore. Along the way, they meet Astrior, who then is like, what are you doing with Thorgester? We know him. We don't like him. We're going to kill y'all. And then they had to say, no, we can kill giants. It's all good. And then she's like, well, we
Word.
got a giant you can kill. Like, you want to kill our giant? And then Senua was like, I guess, yeah, I'll kill your giant too. Because it's attacking your village. Okay. And this one is like water based. It lives down by the shore. So Senua has to go. She sees more boat crashes. I think this section is like I've seen people say this is the hardest puzzle section in the game. Again, don't particularly think it's that difficult. You have to backtrack a little more, but like
Yeah,
everything is kind of right there because it combines the runes and the shifting of the worlds.
yeah. I think it's, again, maybe that's more an indictment on the players rather than the puzzles, whereby really you're switching between two different states of the world to get rid of an obstacle or to bring an obstacle back once you're past it to clear another space. So it's not really that hard to wrap your head around, even if you are having to walk around the environment a little bit first to sort of get your bearings and to understand what affects what. The actual puzzle solving itself is arguably just as basic as everything else in the game. So get better at puzzles, people, for God's sake.
I do like the narrative, like because you have a section where Thorgester and Fargrimmer break off from Astrior and Senua, and they're having a nice like little one-on-one chat. Astrior is like telling them about the village, about how her father is dead, like he was betrayed. Her brothers are dead. They tried to fight the giant, or the Draugr, and they do get attacked by the Draugr. So Astrior is like, I gotta go back. I gotta defend the village. Senua's like, I gotta go find the hidden folk who will tell me the giant's name. And again, she finds out that this giant used to be a member of the village who made a deal to sell out Astrior's father and his fellow friends, which led to their deaths. And again, overcome with guilt, essentially becomes a giant.
Mm-hmm.
So this one, very similar sequence to the first one, where you got their real name, which let me see if I can find it here. Is it? Oh, it's Shijarisi. Is that the real name, or is that the giant name? Either way, I don't know this man's real name. uh, but you get a very similar sequence where she knows the real name. She summons the giant. And then instead of fire, you have waves that will come and drown you. And
Hmm.
this one, you actually have to run up and hold on to the rings, which I didn't get at, like, I did die about twice here until I was like, what button do I have to hit? And I was like, oh, you just hold A. And then from there, this one was probably easier than the last one. The last one was like, you got to stay in the shadows. This one was like, you can sprint in plenty of time. Like, you don't even have to wait for the wave to go away. Once that hitbox is gone, and you'll know
Yep.
when it's gone, you can take off.
Yeah. Yeah. Like, I guess, again, while visually impressive, I am disappointed that it was so similar to the first one.
Mm-hmm.
Not that I have necessarily a worthwhile alternative to contribute as a suggestion, but I do feel that I again, thematically it kind of makes sense because it's Senua literally running up to the thing and constantly being battered or held back, even temporarily, by these things, whether it's fire or waves, which again, sort of, having to overcome things, and despite how much you're pushed back, you have to keep pushing forward. I like the thematics there. But I do kind of wish mechanically there was something a little different. Technically, you could say you have to hold on this time, but
Mm-hmm.
beyond that, I do kind of I longed. I was like, oh, it's the same thing again. It's a cool thing, and it's a good set piece again. But I don't know. Especially as it's the last one. It's the second one, but also the last one. I was like,
Which
well,
I didn't. I got worried because I was like, I hope. I went and checked the achievements, and I was like, there's more achievements after this. Is
hmm,
there another giant? Am I gonna have to do something similar again, just with a different element? I really hope that's not the case, and it wasn't the case,
no,
luckily. But it was my fear at that point that I was like, if they do it again, I think that looks bad.
yeah, yeah. So like, kind of between a rock and a hard place. Like, the two set pieces specifically were visually different, but they just were mechanically essentially the same.
Hmm.
So they didn't overstay their welcome, but also, if you're going to do two, logic would dictate that you'd want the two things to be different outside of the visuals. But that, again, that's nitpicky more so than anything. So I don't want to linger on that necessarily.
Yeah. So she beats the giant. The giant turns to stone, and then now Astrior is like, "Oh my god, you can kill giants! I'm coming with you. We're a foursome now. We're gonna go and we're gonna stop the slave trade." And then this gets to the next chapter is quite short, to be honest, compared to what's come before. Especially the cave chapter, which might be the longest one in the game. But this
Hmm.
one essentially, like, they just go, they're on their way to BV, the place. They get to a
The place.
forest, and this forest is apparently a magical forest where if you either get lost and die, or if you do get out, you're never the same. You're changed forever. And I don't know if I love this forest. I think there's some interesting narrative bits that come out, mainly with Thorgester at the end. He says he
Hmm.
saw something, he made me do it, I think was the line he says. Um, so like clearly he's had a vision of some sort, but he's not like, you never see him in the forest. You only see Astrior and Fargrimmer. And even then it's like, as we touched on, they give you a choice that doesn't matter because you just walk forward and then the paths converge. And it's like the strangest, it's not even like a maze really, because it's linear.
Hmm.
You can't get lost in it. I thought it was going to be similar to what we saw with her dad, like Druth, when he was making me choose the path not to go down.
Mm,
I thought it was going to be like that, but it really wasn't.
yeah. Because you sort of, you do the first loop, and
Mm-hmm.
I think it's Far Grimmer who's like, we're going in circles. We've seen
Yep.
this thing before. I was like, okay, there's going to be some interesting stuff going on here where you have to pay attention to something you
That's what
pass,
I thought too.
keep
Yep.
an eye on your environment, and make sure that you don't pass that thing again. And if you do, you know you've made a mistake. But no, it's linear, which is fine. But again, I feel like if you're going to have that section, and not that the section ran long,
No, it
but if you're
didn't.
going to have the section and you're going to introduce something thematically that's quite interesting, you might as well reflect it mechanically as well. Especially like you said a couple of times, the choice between Astria and Fargrimmer is sort of, it's cool, I guess, but when it ultimately ends up being meaningless, it's sort of
Yep.
almost there, but not quite.
Especially because then we get a very interesting narrative beat with Thorgester, who I said
Yeah,
again mentioned what he said, and at that point I'm like, oh, he's gonna kill his dad. Like his dad is clearly not gonna believe us, and Thorgester is gonna have to save Senua. And I was
yeah.
like, that's what I thought was gonna happen. But we get to BV, his home area. We see a bunch of slaves. It's a blizzard here, right? It's pretty cold. I don't know how anyone's living. They're not wearing many clothes back in the day. Okay, it's freezing. Fargrimmer and Astrior are like, so they're assigned to free the slaves up on their crucifixes,
Mm-hmm.
essentially. And Thorgester's like, Senua, come with me. We're gonna go talk to my dad. We're gonna tell him you can kill giants. It's all good. No need to do this anymore. He doesn't buy it at all. Mainly because as we learn from the hidden folk section of this one, which is again, it's interesting, this one, I think, because like he's very dismissive of Senua. He calls her like a pet almost, like, oh, you brought back a souvenir, is what he
Souvenir,
calls
yeah.
her. He brings back a souvenir. And then we have this section where she kind of recedes into her own mind, and it happens after um what I forget his actual, like, not his actual name, but I forget the guy's name. It was a go I don't know his name. It's I don't know how to pronounce it, but it's spelled that way.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Um, so he kills Thorgester, and then like Senua kind of retracts into her mind where she's having this one-on-one with Thorgester, and he's like, "Oh, my dad's real name is this," and she learns from the hidden folk, which are at this point confirmed to be all in her head because she doesn't go anywhere. Like she's standing in front of him, seeing all
Mm-hmm.
like all this happen, and they're like, "Oh, yeah, there are no giants. He made all this up. Like he's the third giant." And take him out. And I was
Yeah,
like, oh, so we are gonna kill his dad. Like the thing we didn't want to do is what we're ultimately gonna have to do.
yeah. Like, I guess that there's like it. My question to you, Kevin, and I don't know how contentious this question is going to be because I mean it slightly comically.
Mm.
Is this Xbox's Last of Us Part Two? You know, where you're going along the game to do a thing the whole time, and then right at the last minute, the rug is pulled out from you, and you're actually doing the opposite of the thing you thought you were going to be doing the whole time. Is this The Last of Us Part Two?
I think it shares a lot of similar themes with The Last of Us Part Two. I mean that wholeheartedly.
Sure, sure, sure.
I do think that there are similar themes in Senua Saga that you see in The Last of Us Part Two. Um, I didn't feel nearly as depressed playing this game as I did The
Of
Last of Us
course,
Part Two. I don't think that this game didn't leave me with as much unsatisfaction to the ending because I am in the camp of like I still would have killed her. I
that's
still would
fair.
like
That's fair.
I get it, but like it like you beat him. You have that boss fight, which essentially is like just a one-on-one. Again, he gets a rage mode as I mentioned, but it is really just simple combat. Slash him enough until he dies. He starts to get slower as he gets weaker.
Mm.
You decide not to kill him after having some introspection, okay? And then like you kind of just put the rock down. The people are all around you. And then that's kind of the end of the game, right? Like Senua realizes like I don't have to continue the cycle of violence, which is immediately where I was like, this is their Last of Us 2 moment.
Yeah. Yeah. Also their God of War moment in a way. And I'm not trying to be like PlayStation versus
No,
Xbox,
but it is because Xbox has for years asked for a narrative game
yeah.
like PlayStation has gotten.
And also like specifically thematically, I guess Last of Us as well, but also God of War 2018 explicitly essentially ends on the note of, cycle of violence is bad. We need to be better. We need to be the ones that stop it. And spoilers for God of War 2018, that's when Kratos snaps the neck, he puts a stop to it, triggers Ragnarok. And obviously Last of Us, we know. So like I think thematically it's fine. And you have like I certainly have to remain consistent because I don't have a problem with either of those two games. So logic stands, I don't have a problem here. And I think that there is something interesting that the game essentially, besides the slow start, opens with Senua sparing Thorgest's life and ends with her sparing his father's life, despite the clear difference in character of the two. And but similarly, she had the initial first impression similar of both, that they're both monsters. And I think that one of the points of the game is conveying to you that looks can be deceiving, hence the puzzles and looking at stone faces and everything. Looks are deceiving. Nothing is as it seems. And that people aren't always necessarily what you think they are.
I was gonna phrase it as good people can do bad things under the
Yes.
right circumstances, but there's also bad people that do bad things just
Yeah.
because they're bad, but that doesn't mean you have to be bad. Because I do think Senua goes on a good character arc. If we are talking about like she starts off like I want vengeance for my people. I'm gonna kill your dad, but then along the way she's like we're gonna learn a different way to solve it without the violence, and that's the conclusion she reaches at the end. Like let's not continue the death that's going on. And Thorgester, I think, also has a really good character. Like he's probably my second favorite character in this game. Like at first I was like, why aren't we killing this slave trading scumbag? All right. But then like he just grows so much and like his relationship with Senua really develops into I'm like, I don't want to say like, oh, there's some flirting going on, but I do sense like they have good chemistry together and that like, clearly they started to care for one another, whether that's romantically or just in a friendship kind of way. Like I got the sense that like because he says like I'm with you, I'm gonna choose you over my father, and he does, and then it gets him killed.
Yeah, because I think that as the game goes on, it seems pretty clear to me at least that Thorgester is more and more as we get closer to the end of the game, seemingly, obviously we never met him, replicating a lot of the traits that Senua clearly saw in Dillion.
Yep, I thought that as well. Yep,
of supporting her through and despite her psychosis, and believing and following her, which is she not only says a lot in Sacrifice but also in this game of Dillion being the first person that was really like nice to her.
Yeah.
And in a weird way, I guess technically, if you want to be technical, Fargrimr is probably the first person in this game that's nice to her. But I think it's clear that she has, by the end of the game, a far deeper connection with Thorgester than she does with Fargrimr. So, yeah, it's interesting. And equally, again, in a weird way, I suppose Sacrifice starts with her losing the male figure in her life that she admired or cared for the most, and this game ends with that. So again, interesting parallels.
So yeah, here's a funny comparison where I think that the characters in this game are clearly representative of things that she has lost from the last game, where Dillian is similar to Thorgester. I think Astrior could be that female relationship she lost with her mother.
Mhm.
And then Fargrimmer is sort of like a fatherly figure that she never had because
Yes.
Druth was horrible, was a horrible father. Silkenit writes in, just like you can, and if you come join our Discord, says, at the end, we are told the giants are not real and basically an excuse to exert fear and control on people. But we still killed two of them that other people, not in Senua's head, saw too. Do you think these bits of dialogue are also in Senua's reinterpretation? Also, I just want to shout out the narrator sentence, a bit paraphrased. I was too slow to write it down. What do you do when you stare at the void and human eyes stare back? So, do you think that we killed the giants? Did she imagine their reactions to it?
So here's where I may be going quite off the beaten path with my interpretation. I'm not convinced that any of this happened.
My man, time to talk about my theory, all right?
And I'll let you roll on, but I think it's very clear that we didn't kill giants, because we didn't kill giants. You put the first one at rest with her baby, because it's kind of like a tortured soul wandering the earth in so many stories that we've heard across different media, that they can only be laid to rest once you've dealt with the wrong that occurred in their life. And you give the Ilgun her baby and she rests. And similarly, that even by the fact, I think even more specifically, certainly with the second one, because the baby is quite pivotal to the first giant, the act of simply naming them, like learning their name and speaking their name to them, is, I think, quite vitally important, because through all of the stories that the characters in this game tell and the mythology that has clearly been built up around these giants in their respective regions, paints them as something other than human. And it's very explicit in the game that they were, at the very least, even if this is all true and what we're seeing is real, that at one point they were human. So it's, again, going back to the idea of it's not black and white. You can't paint one person with every brush, that kind of thing. Just because they've done monstrous things or made a mistake or given their baby up to somebody that didn't exist or yada, 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 got betrayed by somebody, doesn't make them bad people. You can't vilify them. And by speaking their name to them and allowing them to rest, whether they're giants or not, you're giving them back their humanity, which is something that Senua, technically, whether it's Druth or just the people in her village, has been deprived of her entire life, because she isn't treated as normal or human. And I think that therefore she probably finds a lot of similarities and empathy with the giants, clearly.
That's a very interesting interpretation. I didn't even I never even thought about that's why names hold so much weight, because she's never really had that. Like, no one's ever looked at her as Senua, essentially. They've always looked at her as her mental illness, as her psychosis. That's an interesting theory. So
go off, Kevin. Go off.
I'm with you, Sam. I'm going to take it to an extreme level, okay? I don't think anything in this game happened. I literally wrote, none of this is real. Senua is lost after the first game and doesn't know what her place in this world is. She casts herself in the savior role, which you see throughout this game repeatedly, that everyone she meets, every situation, she is the savior. She's the chosen one. She created these friends that she's always wanted. None of the other characters are real either. These are all figments of her imagination, and they prop her up as the chosen one to defeat the giants. The giants are all allegories for her past trauma. The first giant, a mother gives up their child and then to die, and then she was trapped in a fire. Senua's own mother was burned at the stake. There's the fire, for being a witch, and she left Senua alone. Second giant represents the Northmen coming from the sea because you have the hurricane and killing Dillion. Dillion was betrayed by his fellow man, which again, the second giant was a traitor. The third giant, the tyrant, the Lion King, they call him, aka Druth, her father, builds up and holds on to power at all costs, so as far as to kill his own child. Senua's father tried to kill her. The blizzard illustrates the coldness that ones can feel towards their own loved ones. I think this story is really about Senua finding her place in the world, overcoming those past traumas, not letting them impact her decisions going forward, as we see with her not killing at the end. And then she no longer needs revenge on those that have wronged her. She gives herself the sword in one of the puzzles, which thematically, no one can help her but her. That's my whole theory. All right. I don't think any of this game is real. I think this is her coming to grips with past trauma and trying to figure out, where the hell do I fit in this world? How do I become a functioning member of this society, whatever that looks like? That's my whole theory. I have heard literally no one else say anything remotely close to this, because all I've seen is the giants represent natural disasters. And I'm like, that's a theory. That is the most like bare bones thing I've ever heard, especially when you're dealing with something with psychosis. Like, I personally think my theory has a lot of like credence. Like, I can very much see things like this. And I was saying I would love Ninja Theory to come out and just explain beat by beat, because if it isn't this, there's so much evidence for something like this to be it. And I think when you look at it through this perspective, and I only thought of this theory when Thorgester died. That was the moment when literally everything clicked in my brain. And I was like, they've been like, everything is just about her past traumas, that unless you've played Sacrifice, unless you know all the background of this, you're gonna miss, and you're just gonna see a very bare bones narrative.
I am very compelled. I think he presents a very compelling argument there. So much so that I'm actually henceforth going to believe that that is the truth. Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense.
I've left you speechless, folks.
Slightly mind blown, I guess. Yeah.
It just made sense to me because the whole first game was about accepting Dillion's death. And now what is the next thing that would stop her in, like, her psychosis brain? Like, if she's accepted her psychosis, the next thing that would hold her back is trauma. That she, like, this is a very broken and damaged character. And the only reason I thought of this was because of the dialogue that we've mentioned with Fargrimmer and even herself. Like, she wants to be so special in this game. She has to be the chosen one. Like, she's the only one that figured out how to kill these giants. Like, in a world that isn't fantasy based, right? It's all in her mind. The only thing that makes sense for that to be the case is she's making it up. And why would she make it up? Because she doesn't know who she is.
Interesting. So, not to go too far on a tangent, but I suppose a question that could arise from that would be, if that is the case, and we're under some kind of assumption that there might be a Hellblade 3, would you expect, and I don't need like a massively detailed answer as much as you like, but like, would you then expect that if this is a major deviation in terms of break from reality, would you expect the third game to maybe hone that in more and make the context of this journey more explicit? Or would you think that maybe they leave it a bit more up to interpretation still, as this game currently is? Like,
I I would expect people to be left up to interpretation. Like if Hellblade 3 ever does come out, and there is no mention to Fargrimmer, or like we don't see these characters ever again, maybe they're mentioned in her mind. I think that's still a way for like her brain to her brain thinks they're real. So like of course if she's on a new adventure, she would draw back to that just in her thoughts. But if we never see them again and her next adventure is more like, hey, we think this one's actually happening, then fine. This might get a little morbid, but there is part of me that thinks all of this is in her head and she never got out of the ocean at the start of the game. Like she did get captured by slave traders and she's drowning, and this is just like her dying thoughts. Like she's dying and she wanted to be so much more than what happened in her life. And that's a little too like I don't want to believe that because I want more Senua. But that is another like working theory instead of just me like she could be anywhere in the world and just like imagining this stuff essentially.
Yeah, no, that's an equally compelling theory, I think. And I think that I can understand that some people might hear what your theory is and be like, oh, it was all a dream thing. And I think that there is validity to that criticism, but I think that the way in which you present it it avoids that cliche or story trope by just how explicit the connections are between each of the given events in this game, real or not, to those past trauma events in Senua's life as they've been presented just to us thus far. Because even in this game, you see in one of the visions, I can't remember exactly where it was placed, but you see Senua on a stake. You know, I think she lights it and is burning herself at the stake. So there's definitely, there must be some. I mean, obviously, it's alluding to things, but I think that there is that connection there. Whether that is overtly to the point where none of it's real, or whether it is meant the things are happening, but it's just that Senua is implanting more so than reality is actually dictating her past trauma into those events. I think that is also a potential path there, where it's kind of a middle ground between everything being real and everything not. But I don't know. I like your theory more.
The way I get around the whole "it was all a dream" criticism is I have a master's degree in psychology. For anyone that doesn't know, like I devote my entire education to psychology. Like I'm very much into the psychological learnings. So that's why this game probably resonates with me a lot. There's a common phrase: perception is reality. And it doesn't really matter. Like to her, all of these things are happening. And you can say it's all a dream, but if you told someone with psychosis that was all a dream, like they're not going to believe you because to them it did happen. Like it might not be reality, but it was their reality.
Yes. And like I haven't done it yet, and I to be completely fair, I don't know if I will, not anytime soon. But by collecting all the lore stones and stuff, you unlock alternate narrators.
Yep.
And one of them is Druth, I think.
Yes. Once you collect everything, I believe you get Druth. Just beating the game, you get the others, I believe, which is like Thorgester, Fargrimmer, Astrior, like commenting, providing context. And I've played because I went through chapter select to get all the collectibles with I had them on. I haven't done it with Druth. I'm kind of saving that for like maybe a PC run in the future or something along the lines, like when I feel like replaying this game, because this is one. And I don't know if I've said this, but like I've been thinking about that theory and like how deep I think this game is compared to what I've heard other people say since I rolled credits on it. And that's giving me those Alan Wake 2 vibes where I was obsessed with like theory crafting and like trying to figure it out. Like then the new draft came out. We played through that. Like, I don't know if there's any plans for a Hellblade 3. I don't know if there's any plans for DLC. I would probably expect not. Like that seems not like something Ninja Theory does. But I really do hope at some point we get some sort of answer from the studio, like whether it's a podcast or something. Because I think they did. They've talked about like Senua Sacrifice like that. So
yeah, it'd be interesting to see what does happen going forwards. Because not I don't want to go down this line, but just to bring it up, the idea of expanding to the wider perspective, everything going on with Xbox, and wondering where does this game sit and what are they hoping that this game is or does. And I don't know that is going to dictate whether we get more Hellblade or not, but
Alpaca Tom writes in with a question about that. It says, do you think Ninja Theory is going bye-bye? Wasted time making games for what it seems a small group, not even close to cracking the most played Xbox games, and doing bad on Steam for a new release. They then linked the Steam DB page where it peaked at 3,982 players.
Yeah, so like to be crystal clear, I have written into X Talk a couple of times over the past few weeks, inquiring about essentially this topic. I think I even wrote in the most recent X Talk a question about the Steam numbers. I think I would be disingenuous if I didn't say that I am a little concerned, because from my perspective, if Microsoft specifically, not Xbox, but Microsoft, if their logic and their actions remain consistent as of late, Ninja Theory and the game that they presented doesn't really make sense, certainly not from a first-party perspective anymore, because it's not going to be a big money maker. It hasn't performed well in terms of Steam. Obviously, we don't know what the Game Pass numbers are. I assume we will probably get a splash screen saying how many people have played the game at some point, I would hope, to have some indication. And that will inherently, by proxy, dictate whether we see more of this or not, I would have thought. I'm going to say I don't think Ninja Theory is going away. For many of the reasons that you said, like even if it is just based on the fact of their UE5 experience, I think that does in certain ways make them more valuable than a Tango or whatever, although Tango still doesn't make much sense to me. But I'm also not going to say that I think that they are guaranteed safe.
I think it would be disingenuous in the current industry climate to say anyone is really safe. I feel a little more okay. I know there were reports from Jez Corden that apparently the next game has already been greenlit. They're continuing work on Project Mara. They apparently have other assets, not just like the studio, but they have like a mocap section. Like they have other things that make them valuable, like even to co-develop games. So I personally, like, I understand people that are concerned. I understand that like the game didn't come out score 90s. It probably won't win that many awards. I do think Melina Juergens deserves at least a Game Awards nomination for her performance. I don't know, like we still have half the year to go. What performances are going to come out through the rest of the year? Like she's probably my front runner right now.
Sure.
But like there are things that the game could win. Is it going to win Game of the Year? Absolutely not. Like I do not see it winning that type of award. So it really depends on what Microsoft and Xbox are valuing. Like I really don't like the and we saw this where, and I might have been a little guilty of it, where Bethesda closes studios and then Activision open ones. And I'm like, well, to me, they're all Xbox, right? To the consumer, they're all Xbox. Effectively, though, from what we've been told, they act very independently still. Like they answer to Xbox, but Activision has had this studio in the works for a while. Like Activision is opening a studio. Xbox didn't open a new studio.
Yeah.
Bethesda closed 2 studios. Xbox didn't. And whether I understand Xbox did effectively close them, but that isn't like internally they're operating things.
It's more optics than anything else.
Yes, exactly. So like when I look at Xbox Game Studios, which Ninja Theory falls under, I almost feel like Xbox bought these teams to make the games that they make. It would now be very disingenuous, but not unheard of for them to say, we want something different. But if you bought Ninja Theory to make Ninja Theory style games, that's what they're doing. It's like saying you bought Obsidian to make Obsidian games, which they've been doing, and then coming and say, what if we make a live service shooter? You know, like it doesn't fit. You need to, like, if you bought these teams, let them make what they make. And I would hope instead of shutting them down, they would sell them or allow them to go independent, like Toys for Bob did, like something along those lines. Like, especially Ninja Theory, which has been around for so long. I don't know when Tango was founded, but I do think Tango was not an easier decision for them. But like when Mikami left, they were like, well,
sure,
he made the studio, so we're not going to feel as bad shutting it down.
Yeah, I think you know, the validity I find in those concerns is, yes, they acquired Ninja Theory to make Ninja Theory games, but that was pre-Bethesda,
pre-ABK, yeah.
And you know, indications are that their strategy and their perspective on how they want things to go has shifted over time, as do every company. You know, Xbox isn't the only culprit. But as you said, and that was going to be my final point on the matter, was that I think Ninja Theory, regardless of your thoughts on this game, and even though I do say that the game ultimately disappointed me in totality, I still think that they hold enough value, it clearly in talent, but also renown. And as far as I know, outside of the leader going a few years ago, I haven't heard of much talent bleed from Ninja Theory. So they're pretty consistent talent-wise internally. Quality of their games have been relatively on a good track record.
It's that's why I like this. Like they're good. We're gonna get you 80s.
Yes, and you know, now that they have specific UE5 experience and, like you said, the motion capture studio, which is clearly, if not top of the line, amongst the best. I think that the worst case scenario is that they'd be sold. I think that if there was speculation going around internally that Ninja Theory was at risk of being cut, I think a third party, someone, would step in and make an offer. And I don't know why Microsoft wouldn't take that and close them down regardless. That wouldn't make any sense. So I think Ninja Theory are safe. Whether they stay under Xbox long term or not, I'm less sure. But ultimately, that it doesn't matter if they still get to make the games they want to make.
And I just opened my Xbox app on PC, and in the trending now section, Hellblade is number 2 on there.
Okay.
So it's right below Diablo 4 for PC, which Diablo just had a giant update.
That's more promising. So
I do, and we'll get off. We're going to wrap this up because I think we've said most of what we need to about the game, and then these closing comments. But I do think that people after Tango got closed are getting a little hung up on sales now. And I struggle with that because, again, you can't push Game Pass and sales at the same time. Then it just doesn't make any sense strategically. Like, you have to, are you trying to get Game Pass subscribers? Are you trying to get engagement? Or are you trying to sell the games? Because when you put your games in a subscription service, you're not going to sell them. 4,000 peak on Steam, like I'm sure it's sold thousands of copies after that, but like 4,000 at its peak isn't very good. But how many people are playing that through PC Game Pass because they're like, I'm not going to spend $50, I'll spend $10 on PC Game Pass and play it there. So it is one of the things where, like, I'm not sure pulling these metrics like that is doing anyone any good, especially because I'm unsure what Xbox's key metrics are at the moment.
Yeah. I think people can raise, and again, some people will raise those concerns regardless because they've already shut down X Studio or whatever. But I think that if it becomes, because you know, to be fair, Sony has closed studios in the not too distant past, and I've certainly been critical of it. But again, it's kind of like with Tango and with Arcane Austin, makes sense with the studios they're closing. If it becomes a pattern and it's games that are just underperforming a little bit or not quite being critical successes, and the studios keep closing, then of course the concerns become far more valid. But I think right now we're just in a bit of a nebulous period where we're not quite sure which way the wind's blowing. So you can still raise your concerns, but I wouldn't necessarily like doom and gloom just yet.
Yeah, that's exactly how I feel. Don't. Oh, the world is falling. Every studio is going to close. Like,
yeah,
let's just see what happens. By and large, I think there is a plan, and Hellblade 2,
Fingers
whether
crossed.
it, yeah, whether it underperforms, I don't know. All I know is like our conversation here. I do think at the end of the day, Hellblade 2 for me, from a narrative visual standpoint, has a lot going for it. I don't like this game more than Hellblade 1. And I say that with my giant theory crafting here, which I love and like makes me love the game more.
Yeah.
But like Hellblade 1 will always be the superior game for me just because it has all of the like it has better combat, it has better puzzles, it has a better narrative. It just doesn't have the visuals.
Yeah.
And it sucks that it sucks that I don't love this more than the first one because I wanted to. Like I wanted this game to come out and everything be better.
Yep.
But that doesn't mean it's a bad game. I'm never gonna say this is a bad game because I love a lot about this game, and at the end of the day, I like this game a lot.
Yeah. Yeah, I think like my closing salvo would be sort of what I said at the start and in the Discord, where I think I enjoyed the experience pretty well. I do think, if I'm being truthful, that the parts of Hellblade 2 that make it a game are arguably the worst parts of it. That being, you know, combat and puzzles. But ultimately, like I said in the Discord, it is a great thing for Game Pass. I don't mean that in a bad way. I just mean you have access to this. I highly encourage people at least check it out. If not just for the visuals, to be blown away by that for 5-10 minutes. If that's all you need and you're done, that's fine. But I would implore you to see it through. It doesn't last that long. I am disappointed overall. I was hoping for more and for better. But that doesn't, as you said, doesn't take away from the fact that it isn't by any metric a bad experience. It's not a bad game. It's just underwhelming for me, but that is subjective. So go in, see what you think, and you might end up loving it.
Absolutely. Well, we're going to call it there on the nearly 2-hour
Hell yeah.
Spoilercast for Hellblade 2. So, everyone, if you've played the game, and certainly I hope you have, if you're listening to this far into it, make sure to drop your comments down below. Let us know your thoughts about the game. Let us know your story ideas. How rate mine, all right? Let me know your theories. Let me know your working theories. You can find us over in the Save the Game Media Discord. You can find us both on Twitter as well. Sam, if you want to drop your handle.
Anywhere and everywhere at Sam Heaney, Heaney.
And you can find me at the Muffin Mon. It's a 1 and 7 I, O and 7 A. Follow us at Save Game Media to stay up to date with all of the latest. Until next time, goodbye.
Peace.